Kyllä sähköisyyden
Ja, ég kann ekki við að setja sko aðra en það
Jæja, góðan daginn og velkomin í Vísindaportið. Þetta meina að bíða. Þetta líka síðasta Vísindaportið á árið 2019, árum við förum í jólafrí, svo náttúrulega hittum við aftur í janúar. En ég ætla bara að svissa yfir á ensku og kynna inn þær Linda Randall og Marie Meyer. So we'll switch to English because our talk today is in English. Happy to see you all. And happy to introduce these two lovely ladies from Nordregio to talk about digitalisation. And that's something that maybe some of us are a bit hesitant, you know, it's happening, but we don't know, are there opportunities? Is it something that we should be afraid of? But I think they will sort things out very well. And I hope that some of you will also participate in the workshop that will follow on this talk. So please go ahead, Linda and Marie.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also thank you for introducing us in English. I had a funny experience actually in Latvia some weeks ago, and they had the event in Latvian and English with simultaneous translation. The presenter before me presented in English, so I'd taken out my earphones and put them to the side, and then all of a sudden the moderator was introducing me in Latvian, and I didn't have my things, so I had absolutely no idea what he promised that I was going to do. So thank you. It's nice to have an introduction in English. So I'm Linda Randall, and this is my colleague Mari. And we're going to, I don't know if we'll get all the way from threat to opportunity when we think of digitalisation, but hopefully we can maybe clear up some parts and maybe give you some ideas from around the Nordic region that might help us feel a bit more enthusiastic about technological change. We come from Nordregio in the lovely island of Hepholmen, which is a slightly different kind of setting to here, I guess. We also have water all around, but we're right in the middle of Stockholm. So Nordregio is, for those of you who don't know already, it's an international research centre for regional development and planning, and it's part of the Nordic family. So I guess there's two things that's kind of important to know about what we do. The first is that most of our work is having a Nordic focus. So we look at Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. And we try to understand, okay, what things are the same here and what things are different. And what can we learn from one another, and what things can we do that we can be stronger together. And the second thing that's important to know about Nordregio is that we're always asked our questions. We're social scientists, but we mostly ask questions about place. So why is this thing? We're less interested in a social phenomenon in and of itself, and more interested in why or why not it would happen in one place and not another. So we always have this kind of geographical lens. I think it's probably good to know that in the context of digitalisation. So what I want to do, what we're going to try and do for you today is we've sort of got 4 main bits that we want to cover. So first I want to, I hope that it will be okay to start at sort of quite a basic place, because for Nordregio, that's where we kind of started with this topic, just saying digitalisation, what is this? And most importantly, what is this? What's our piece of this? What does this mean from a regional development perspective? So I want to sort of cover a bit of that. How do we think about digitalisation from a regional development perspective? What sorts of questions do we ask? Then I want to share with you some results from a big study that we did on digitalisation last year that was quite broad, and it was mostly looking at digitalisation in the public sector, but I'm going to focus on some of the findings that I think are particularly relevant, that can maybe cross boundaries a bit more, so they might also be relevant in a business context, education context, in different places. And then I'm going to hand over to Mari, and she's going to dive more in depth in a particular case related to the blue bioeconomy in the cross-border region in Norway, Sweden, and she'll fill you in on some details with that. And we'll give you a very, very short intro to the project the reason why we're here today, actually, which is a project about digitalisation in rural communities. And I hope that some of you will join us downstairs after for some lunch and to discuss a bit more. So does that sound all right for everybody? Yeah, great. But before you hear from me, I actually just want to hear a little bit from you, and I think maybe we're a good number of people. We could just take a couple of minutes with your colleagues at the tables and just a really basic question: what is digitalisation from your perspective? So when you think of, I'm coming to a presentation today about digitalisation, what is it? So yeah, take a couple of minutes and then hopefully we can share them together. Oh, do you want to join? Maybe join with these guys over here. Okay, I'm glad. I always hate to stop a good discussion, but I think it's a big question that we could talk all day about. And a bit of a spoiler alert: there's no right answer to this question, obviously. But I'm keen to hear. You guys are the biggest table, so you get to tell me quickly. What did you manage to come up with a definition?
Not the definition.
Yeah, but what did you discuss?
We discussed mostly a little bit about the threats. We discussed what it might entail for a person and for a community. And as happens, we started focusing on the threats of losing jobs and things like that very fast.
Okay.
In the communication.
Okay, that's interesting. What about you guys over here? Where did you go straight away? What was the immediate response to the question?
I thought that we don't have to come here to listen to the lunch lecture any longer. We're streaming everything on YouTube as well.
I was wondering where that was going there. I was like, oh, I only spoke for 5 minutes. And then yeah.
But yeah, doing things that you normally would have done before in the flash, so to speak, and new and old things without having to be in the flash.
This kind of absence of physical space, And I think actually that's quite a nice segue to actually the way that we define digitalisation, because I think that taps into what we see as a very important element. So we're social scientists, so we're interested in social process. So for us, we define digitalisation as the transformation of all sectors of our economy, government and society based on the large-scale adoption of existing and emerging digital technologies. So there's quite a lot in there. So I guess I want to draw attention to kind of a couple of parts of that I think are particularly important when we think about digitalisation from a regional development perspective. So the first is this transformative aspect. So digitalisation is not a specific thing. It's not a specific thing in and of itself. It's actually something that's happening to everything else. And it's crossing across all sectors. It's not happening just in the technology sector. It's not happening just in business. It's not happening just in government. It's happening in all these worlds simultaneously. And I think one thing that's really important to note about this is that it's not just one piece of our work. It actually crosses over all of our work in different ways, in big and small ways sometimes. And it also means it's not something that we can opt out of. So, for example, a tourism company might decide that they're not into the platform economy and they don't want to be on, for example, booking.com. Just because they made that decision doesn't mean they won't be affected by digitalisation. Actually, they might be more affected than someone who participates because it will affect, they have to think about how else will people find out about my accommodations. The second thing I really want to highlight is this notion of existing and emerging digital technologies. So we're not finished yet. This is not something that happened and we can look at it and we can study it in a very nice, tidy way. This is something that's happening now. So many of the technologies that this sort of revolution will be based upon, we already know about them, we already use them in everyday life. They're already adopted on a large scale. So we can kind of already start to think about how they're transforming our lives. But there's other technologies that maybe from a technological perspective, they exist, but we haven't yet adopted them in a way that's I guess we can say transformative. So good examples of these might be driverless cars, 3D printers. They exist from a technological point of view, but they haven't really changed things in a fundamental way yet because we haven't started using them in that way. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of technologies that haven't even been thought of yet. We don't even know what they're going to be. So we're building infrastructure for things that we don't know necessarily what it's going to be for yet. So I think, I guess the point here is, this is a big thing. This is a big thing. It's happening to everything and we can study it in different ways. So this is how we understand it. And of course, these understandings are changing all the time. So when we sort of took that and we went, okay, if this is what it is it in our context? What does it mean to think about sustainable regional development? What does it mean to think about digitalisation in this context of sustainable regional development? And for me, it was, I'm a researcher, so it helps me to have like a nice framework and it helps me to have a familiar framework, I think, especially when you go into, we talked a little bit about fear. I think when you think about, when I first took over our first project at Nordregio, I was terrified because I don't know that much about technology. And I was in this kind of fear space of how am I going to have a project about technology? And that's where it was quite comforting for me to sort of really understand that actually this conversation that we're having here is not necessarily about technology, it's actually about people. And the frameworks that I have for understanding regional development can actually help me to understand digitalisation in that context. And I think this is a very useful one to me, this notion of the social, economic and environmental aspects of a problem. And so we sort of did a bit of work at Nordregio and we tried to kind of map some of the things. So what are some of the things that we could be interested in in terms of digitalisation? And I think in a very fundamental level, we have to think about digital access and connectivity. And in this sense, I think Iceland performs very, very, I think Iceland is in a very fortunate position. It's hopefully not too small, but the important thing to point out here is, so the darker ones are the Nordic and Baltic countries. This is all the countries in Europe, and they're organised in order of the gap between coverage in urban areas and coverage in rural areas. So Iceland is doing very well, both in the sense of having very good coverage overall, but also so it doesn't seem to matter where you live, you should be able to access similar level of coverage. And I know the goal is to make this even better by 2020. So I guess here you have a really good foundation for that. But of course, we have to also acknowledge that digital access is not just about infrastructure, it's also about knowing how to use the technologies and also overcoming some of those barriers when it comes to particular groups in society might have more or less trouble with the transition to accessing a service online. So, and I mean, this is particularly important if we think about the different aspects of life, social life, that are moving online. So citizen participation, perhaps, and definitely e-services. So I think e-services are really key. And so it's important, if we're going to put our services online, we need to make sure, of course, everybody can access them. From an economic perspective, of course, we see a lot of new business opportunities coming about as a result of digitalisation and increased productivity as well. So I think we start to hear, we don't have that much evidence about it yet, but we start to hear some conversations about this notion of kind of sometimes called reshoring. So this idea that with digitalisation, some of the production processes that have been moved to places with cheaper labour than the Nordics could potentially either maybe not come back, but new ones might emerge because of the ability to automate different processes. But of course, as the guys up the back noted, the first thing we go to is these labour market impacts. So the robots are coming to steal all of our jobs, this conversation. And I think this is a particularly, this is not a new conversation. And actually, I mean, robots have been taking over our jobs for a very long time. We have a long history of technology actually coming into different work roles. And what we've seen historically is that while that might result in some short-term unemployment, in the longer term, it just results in higher value sort of jobs, and so jobs that are more rewarding. At the same time, there's some people who argue that this time it's different. That the potential of artificial intelligence and machine learning to take over jobs in sort of medium and even high skilled jobs means that we will actually see more unemployment this time around. It remains to be seen whether the pace of change will keep up. This is a map of Denmark. Unfortunately, I have a map of Iceland because employment data in Iceland is at the below the national level is very hard to come by. But basically, this shows the percentage, the amount of work tasks that can currently be done by a machine. So job tasks that people in jobs in Denmark currently do by hand, but that could be automated using current technology. And the darkest blue means the highest percentage of tasks. So you can see over, and I mean, I think the point that I want to make, and of course this is Denmark, this is not Iceland, but I think if we did it in Iceland, we might get a similar picture, is that you can see over here in Copenhagen, we have, it's not as dark. So it's actually, I think from our point of view, the question is not how many jobs will be automated, will the jobs be automated? The question is about what will the spatial, like, how will different places be affected differently by automation? So even if only 200 jobs are going to be automated, everyone else is going to keep their jobs. If those 200 jobs are in one place, and if that place has only 700 jobs altogether, that's going to have a big impact on that community. Obviously, that's not a great example, but you understand the point. So, we're quite interested in these kinds of questions. And of course, from an environmental perspective as well, we start to see new green business opportunities coming out, smart solutions to climate change, and also new ways of coming together online. So I think sometimes we're a bit quick to sort of see social media and these platforms as being kind of a bit scary and evil, but they're also bringing us together in new ways. So I think that's quite interesting. And then in the middle, I think when we started that, we sort of came up with, well, what sort of fits in the middle? And then we're like, well, how do we actually manage all of this stuff? This is a lot of different stuff going on. This is not sort of one person's job to take care of all of this. So that's when we sort of decided to go out into the world and talk to people that were actually working in Nordic regions. So we went out to 5 different regions and we spoke to people in regional and local governance, and we spoke to people in the business community. We spoke to people mostly public service. But I think some of the things that we found there were quite relevant. And I want to just touch on 3 key things that I thought are quite interesting from that study, from what we found. And the first being that context matters. So this is not, digitalisation won't play out the same way everywhere. And we saw that the approaches that public administrations were taking to working with digitalisation were very much shaped by what was happening in that particular place at a given time. So this is Vardø municipality in Norway. This is the easternmost municipality in Norway. Actually, interestingly, is further east than Istanbul, if you can imagine. So it's very far away from Oslo. And Vardø it's quite a small community. In 2010, there were 3,200. And from that point, they experienced a crisis. They experienced a crisis in the fisheries sector was not doing well. There was an army base that moved away. The Population Bureau of Norway predicted there would be a significant drop in the population. The drop was almost twice as bad as predicted. So they went from being 3,200 in 2000 to being 2,200 by 2010. So they understood they were having unemployment rate 30%. The school was one of the 40 worst in Norway. They got a nice letter saying, you congratulations, you're one of the 40 worst schools in Norway. You need to come and be in a program with us. The national government had actually taken over the city finances. So they were in a bad condition. And they took some meetings to, okay, what are we going to do about this? And they, in the response, the administration decided we're going to completely rethink our approach to public services. We're going to use technology to do it. And our aim is going to be to make a good life for the citizens of Vardø. So just because you live closer to the Arctic Circle than to the capital doesn't mean that you can't access a world-class education. It doesn't mean that you can't have world-class public services. It doesn't mean that you can't have a job in the public sector where you learn and grow and develop all the time. So they saved. They had to cut some costs, obviously, but they also invested some money. They invested in broadband, and they invested in the school. They gave an iPad to every student and every teacher. And the actual piece of technology was less important than what they did with it. They used that iPad to actually transform the way they delivered education. So to deliver education in a more flexible way. So it meant that if I was sitting next to someone in class, I didn't necessarily have to be doing the same work as them. So we could tailor the work to the level of the student, even in a small environment, and without actually singling that child out as saying you need additional help. So so that was the main strategy I want to sort of highlight. There was a bunch of other stuff happening as well. But I think what's really telling is that in less than 5 years, Vardø School's gone from being one of the 40 worst in Norway to being above average at the regional and national level. All of the people that graduated from that school in 2016 made a successful transition from school to either work or further education. And imagine that's coming from a 30% unemployment rate only 5 years earlier. The population hasn't begun to increase again, but it's stopped decreasing. So they're still 2,200 6 years later. So this was a particular, one particular context. Here's a very different one. This is the city of Tampere in sort of the middle of Finland. And I think it's impossible to understand the city of Tampere's approach to digitalisation without sort of first understanding their kind of industrial development trajectory. So signals technology, which it's not that important to understand what that is. It took me some time to figure out what it was, and then I realized, okay, so it's good to check, but it's basically the thing that you need to have a mobile phone. Started developing in Tampere long before we even had mobile phones. And this made it a really important place for the development of Nokia. Later, Microsoft came along. And these two companies shaped the innovation environment in Tampere in a really important, two really important ways. So firstly, they acted as sort of an incubator for ICT skills. So not just for local people to learn ICT skills, but also to attract people from around the world, to talent from around the world to come. And the second thing that was important was that these people formed really strong networks working together in the same company. They made up different teams. And then we all know this, we all know parts of the story. In 2008, we started to hear Google, we started to hear the little Nokia phones that pretty much, I think, did everyone have one of these? Is everyone old enough to have had one of these tiny little Nokia phones? And they started to get some competitors and they lost a big part of their market share. So they laid off about 20% of their workforce across Finland. 2,500 of those people were in Tampere. At the same time, Microsoft left. So the city had the region had a really unique problem. They had an oversupply of incredibly highly skilled, highly educated technology workers who all knew each other. And turns out, I mean, not to downplay, it was a very difficult period, but actually in the longer term, that's proved to be a really rich environment for innovation. So the approach to digitalisation that the city of Tampere has is actually sort of, I think, shaped by that in a really important way. So they have these different domains in which they try to approach technological change within the city, and each of those they're not led by the municipality, they're actually led by industry leaders. And I guess the point is, I could explain this whole, I'm not going to explain this whole Smart City Tampere program, but my point, and I think what's important for us to understand, is that I can't just pick that program up and put it somewhere else, because all of that stuff came before is really important. And I think that lesson is quite relevant whether you're a company, whether you're a small community, whether you're a big community. It's, okay, where have I been? And what does that mean for where I'm going? So context matters. The next lesson I think that was really important for my study was that smart is not just digital. So smart is not just about digital technologies, it's about how do we work in new ways. So another one of our cases was the city of Helsingborg in Sweden, and they are really big on, they don't want innovation to just come from the top. They want anyone working in any department at any given time to have an idea and feel confident to try that idea out. So the idea is that think big, start small, and then scale or fail fast. So they try to create an environment where it's okay to have a small failure. I don't know how I feel about really big failures. I tried to get them in on the interviews, but so I mean, they dealt with, I think, coming back again to this idea of fear. There was a lot of fear in the beginning of this, and one of the strategies that they said was really vital was celebrating every success. So if someone had a small idea and it became something big, it became something great, really making sure that everyone in the organisation knows about that and knows, where did that start? Oh, that was just Lars in this department. Here in Iceland, we visited Reykjavik. And I think they also focused on improving city services by encouraging people to work together in new ways was really the key. I mean, three different things were happening: working cross-departmentally, so thinking not just about, okay, who does what in our city structure, but what does this person need? So starting with the citizen, or starting with, in a business sense, the customer, and then thinking about all the functions as they wrap around that person. Also vertically, so if they want to have a new solution, it's not just the management team sitting there, it's someone from every point in that service kind of journey. So the person that delivers the service, maybe their team leader, someone from each level, and cross-sectorally, so working with small startups maybe. And I think the most interesting thing about the Reykjavik journey is that they were really stuck with digitalisation until they took it out of the IT department. So it was sitting, all this digital service transformation was in the IT department and it was stuck. They took it out, they gave it to someone with a background in social work, someone with a background in pedagogy, and someone with a background in business, and it's been blooming ever since. So I think that takes me to the last point that I want to make, and that's that digitalization it's a human process. It's much less to do. I mean, of course, technology is a part of it, but most of our interviewees, actually, it's quite common to talk about sort of 20% is technology and 80% is this human endeavor. And for me, that got rid of the fear for me, because like 20%, I can get someone else to do that part. I can get someone to help me with that part. Working with people, I think all of us have. I can tell, even just by the way you engage when I ask the question straight up, that you know how to do that. And I think in the way that we think, so what is that other 80%? And that other 80%, according to our interviewees, is a process of change management. And I think the last example I want to give before I hand over to Mari is actually coming from one of our participants in Tampere. And I think he explains this change management process in a really nice way, especially this 80-20 kind of bit. So he says, imagine we have 5 metal bands. He was Finnish, he's coming. And we think, okay, metal, it's a little bit yesterday. We want to move on from metal now. We want to go for something that will stand the test of time, something that will never date. We're going to turn them into a symphony orchestra. So we buy some new instruments and we give them to the band. So we have the musicians, we have the instruments, we have a symphony orchestra, right? And of course, that sounds ridiculous, but it's actually quite reminiscent of the way that we sometimes work with technology. We have a team of people that do a job. We have a problem. We bring in a technical solution, and we think that our job is done. And actually, according to the people that are really doing this work well, the journey is just beginning at that point. And so that other 80%, a lot of it is really about change management, about managing change. So that was, 3 things that I learned from, I hope that's helpful. And I'm going to pass over to Mari now for change the pace a little bit and go a bit more in detail on a subject that I think is quite relevant in this part of the world.
Yes. Well, I hope it will be. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a very specific case that we did, which was about digitalization as enabling blue growth in the cross-border area of Svinesund. I will try to focus mostly on the aspect of digitalization and what that looks like and how that is enabling blue growth in Svinesund, or even if it is. I'm not sure it is. But I can't really omit the cross-border aspect of this because it was commissioned by a cross-border committee, and thus it is tainted by that frame as well. So just bear with me. But I think when it comes to the cross-border element, even if this is between 2 countries, it also kind of speaks to the collaborations that we do need in order to make this transition happen. Basically. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where Svinesund is. I don't know how familiar you are with the southwest coast of Sweden and the southeast coast of Norway, but it's situated where you can see it in green there. There are actually about 2 million people living in this area. Most of them obviously around the Gothenburg area, but there's also quite a lot of people living in Østfold, and Østfold is also very close to the Norwegian capital Oslo, which has actually some sort of relevance because the positioning of power centers matters for how we, for what is actually being seen on the national agenda. But so does also the industries around it, and where we are quite path dependent in the Nordic countries in general. We tend to focus our energies where we have focused them before. So for fisheries in Norway, for example, it is the northwest coast that's still, the big fish. And I think it's quite telling because when I was commissioned with this project, I was, they said, oh, we want to look at blue growth in the Svinesund area. And I was like, well, is there blue growth? Do they fish? I didn't realize they even had a big fishing industry in this area. And I think that says something about the position that this area has had also on the Norwegian agenda. I'm Norwegian myself, that's why I say that. They have done some studies for the Svinesund as a mega region as well. Although that's mainly focusing on the aspects of mobility and transportation and how people can work across borders and all that kind of stuff, it's still talking about understanding this area as a mega region and how they can actually come together and become a stronger voice in the Scandinavian area, basically. So yeah, that was that. And as I said, I didn't know that they were even fishing in this area, but they're actually one of the biggest producers of shrimp, oysters, mussels, mackerel as well is also very big. And I don't know why I didn't know that, because mackerel and tomato sauce is one of my favorite to have on bread. And aquaculture is also on the rise, and they really want to try and do something different. But there are some barriers here, which I will go a little bit further into. And it is a slightly different sea to what we normally think about when we think about aquaculture and we think about fishing. We think, well, for me, obviously, and also for Iceland, it is, the big fishing trawlers. It's the northwestern coast of Norway for me. It is these huge fish farms around the Norwegian coast. That's how I frame it in my head when I think about it. But Skagerrak, the area, which is here, is even contested as being an ocean. Like, they can't really agree on whether that is even a place. So as such, it's interesting, but it is a different type of ocean. It's a very nutritious ocean, so they actually have different types of products. And I think when it comes to aquaculture, it's about finding new products and how to scale it up and how to use digitalization to make that happen. The area is also characterized by having a lot of micro and small enterprises. When I say micro, I mean one person. It's one or two people working on this. And they're also mainly men. That is not a problem. But I think when it comes to digitalization, and this lens is that quite a lot of them are about to retire. They are maybe not the ones that are first on the ball when it comes to adopting new technologies, and quite a lot of them as well, when we spoke to them, were very critical of having something tread down on their head and having to adopt things rather than coming from the bottom up and asking for it themselves. But so for this study, we interviewed, so obviously this is part of the cross-border study, and for that I had to talk to various different actors, not just fishermen and entrepreneurs, but also the regional authorities and the funding and the support systems as well, to understand what does it actually look like and how do they collaborate across the borders. So we had 7 interviews. We also had 2 workshops in Halden in Norway in June and February last year. And obviously the fun job of desktop research, so just looking through policy documents, which is a huge job, especially when it comes to maritime things. So what do we actually do, when it comes to digitalization and the marine sector? And on the national level, in both Sweden and Norway, it is really high. Digitalization plays a huge role. It is a mega trend. It's a horizontal policy objective. It feeds into absolutely everything that we do. So pretty much any document that you read that is quite new from the Swedish or the Norwegian government will talk about digitalization in one way or another. They talk about it in terms of being smarter societies. They talk about it in terms of new skills. They talk about renewed creativity, and they talk about smarter industries. That's what digitalization means in this context. And as you can see, quite a lot of different documents there. When it comes to the marine sector, it's a bit interesting because they frame it very differently from in the Norwegian and the Swedish context. Marine is often equated with maritime, and that is also kind of mirroring the history of the 2 countries. So Sweden, and especially in Gothenburg, if we look at the regional part of Västra Götaland, they have a very strong history of maritime, with the maritime industry, with wharfs and whatnot. Maybe not so much in terms of fishing. And in Östfold, well, they talk about the bioeconomy, but they don't necessarily talk about the blue bioeconomy. They talk about the green one, because there's a lot of forest, and they share it with Värmland, which is one of these massive forest bioeconomy hubs. So when it comes to the marine sector and the marine focus in the national documents and in the regional documents, you won't find it so much in the regional documents, but you will find it in the national documents in terms of R&D and I, so research, development and innovation. They talk about it in terms of growth, and they talk about it in terms of skills. And it's all framed within the areas where fishing plays a big role. So like in Norway, in Norway it's the northwest coast. In Sweden, it's the Baltic Sea. If you look through these documents and you search for Skagerrak or for Kattegat or for the western seas, nothing shows up. It is not mentioned whatsoever. And that was quite interesting, actually. So maybe it wasn't so strange that I didn't know that they were fishing and there was a big fishing industry there, because it isn't even really considered. And if it is so small, then how can research and innovation, growth and skills be kind of relevant for these industries? And obviously it is. They also need these things, but it's about scaling it and making sure that it actually is tailored towards micro and small companies. So we looked a little bit about at the digitalization support then at the regional level as well. Like what is actually there for the fishermen and fish? What do you actually say? Do you say, because fishermen is a very gendered way of talking about fishers, people working in the fishing sector. I had a really hard time actually just thinking about that. But anyway, how are they supported? And the interesting thing is that it's very different on both sides. And it's also kind of mirroring what I just said about the scale of things. So in Sweden, for example, there is financial support to develop digital strategies, and you can get a consultant in and they will help you, which is great if you're one person, because you need that help. You don't have necessarily the time to do that yourself, sit down, learn and teach yourself how to use digital technologies for this purpose, because you are the only one who creates your salary and generates revenues for yourself. But the problem in Sweden is that if you look at it and look at the requirements, each of the companies need to have between 2 and 49 employees, and you also need to have an annual turnover of 3 million Swedish crowns in order to be able to be part of this. And you also have to have stable financial systems, finances in your company. But the problem is that for one person, 3 million crowns is a huge threshold to actually come above. It means they would have to have, I think someone said they have to produce about 250,000 oysters a year. That's the size of the crop they'd have to have in order to get there. There is no oyster farmer in Sweden that actually has that in that coastal area, because they're too small. In Norway, it's slightly different. There's an upper roof rather, so like you have an upper ceiling for participation. So it's just turning it a bit around. You can't have more than so and so many employees, and you can't have more than 3 million or 10 million euros in revenues. So it's a bit more open that way. It is also, in Norway, also have this, it's guided by the Innovation Norway, and this is something called Omstillingsmotoren, which is the engine of change, which is a program that they have. But it still comes down to one thing, and that is time and resources. For a single or two-person company, it is too big. So the eligibility to actually be part of this is quite a challenge. And then back to challenges, a bit more about challenges. As I said, the support structures are not necessarily there. But another thing that's quite interesting is that you look at the digital access to digital infrastructure in the areas where these companies are operating, and that can be quite minimal. Because at least in Sweden, if you look at how it is when it comes to like creating digital infrastructure, if you're less than 500 people in a place, it's not commercially viable for a company to build digital infrastructure there, so they won't. So what you have to do is form little associations in order to then come together and apply for money, and then the municipality will support it, and the region will support it, and the company will come and build it. So it's a very much more bottom-up kind of driven what's it called, approach to creating digital infrastructure. So that is quite interesting. And if people are living in these areas, and they are the people that are doing fishing, and they are the ones that need the digital infrastructure in order to scale up their businesses, well, that's going to be quite difficult, because what if the other people in the village don't want it, or don't need it, or don't need higher megabit on their connection. The other issue here is also the regulatory framework. The legal system seems to be lagging quite a lot behind. And again, I'm talking about Sweden, especially when it comes to, for example, land-based aquaculture. You want to scale up and you want to be able to like use digital tools to create a bigger market and everything. And for that, you obviously need the stock to sell. But in Sweden, aquaculture is regulated under animal husbandry. And that has really strict laws connected to it, which makes it difficult actually to scale up. So there are so many other things happening at the same time, like this frustration about not being able to scale up your business, that digitalizing or being part of the digital transformation is not the first priority, even though that could actually help them to become bigger and have more revenues and access this digital support systems that is in place. So it's a bit of a catch-22. You can't really win unless something changes. And thankfully, actually, Skagerrak and that area is now being recognized in both of the new ocean policies that are coming out from both Norway and Sweden. So that's quite nice. That's very new as of September this year. So I just want to draw your attention to this one quote that one of our interviews said, and that is that our society is pushing for digital solutions and requirements, but fulfilling these are difficult when the basic frameworks are not in place. That is kind of the dilemma. You have a government and a society that says that this is how you should do it, this is how you could do it, but at the same time they're not really ready to provide you with the tools to actually get there. That could be a bit difficult. If we continue a little bit about the challenges when it comes to digitalization, it is a perception of risk that is involved in this as well. And that is maybe down to the fact that the people who are in this fishing industry aren't necessarily the ones that will be the first adopters of the next app. And it's also an idea of what is actually digitalization. Quite a lot of them think that digitalization is developing an app themselves. It's developing a new tool, it's developing a robot, and there's all these kind of things. And they simply don't have the skills for that. But it's then, with one of the support structures in Norway, which is called Smart Innovation Norway, they try to change that mindset and to have them think about digitalization as a way to change their business models, to put the customer at the center rather. So it's about changing the perception of what digitalization actually is for the individual fisherman or person working in the fishing industry. And it's again about prioritizing digitalization. It's about the time and the human and financial resources that you have available. And if you don't have any of this, then why should you collaborate as well? It's just time consuming. So that sounds all very negative. I'm very sorry. And these are the barriers, and you can see that as well in this kind of reflects it. This is from the workshop we had. The barriers are quite vast. There's quite a lot of them that they identified themselves. And then you also have the measures at the bottom here. And I think what is really interesting here is that, on the politics and society, you have the regulations, you have the digital infrastructure also at sea to be able to, report back on the spot about the catches that you're making. It's also about the actual practical value of digitalization, making people understand what is the added value. Why should I be digital? Why should, everything works? It's always worked. So why should I bother? And it's about that, I think. Then slightly more positive of the opportunities. And the opportunities here lies in what's determining actually what I just said about what digitalization means for the individual person and the individual SME or micro SME. It could be a tool. It could be that it is something that they want to develop or collaborate with someone to develop a new product or a tool. It's about finding that new direction, and it's about finding that new business model. It's about understanding that digitalization can help you create a much bigger market because you can actually extend so much further. And also about how you brand and the opportunity to brand your product even more and spread the word that way. it requires a mindset change in that way. It is, as Linda was saying, it is it's the human element in this. They need to be willing also to take it on board and everything. And then the support structures actually need to be able to cater then to micro-sized companies. So it has a transformative power in the fisheries industry. And it requires new skills, but this is also a fantastic opportunity. When it comes to the future, for example, will the fishing industry look the same? I don't think so. It might. Aspects of it will be the same. But it's also about like having that vision, like what could it actually be? And that's maybe where young people will come in. That's because they're worried about losing. They're worried about losing the next generation. That there won't be any people in the fishing industry in the Svinesund area. But digitalization might actually make it relevant for the next generation. And again, it's about branding and it's about finding that kind of voice that you have. And it's not about being the same as everybody else. It's about finding that unique voice, and digitalization could be part of that. It's not the cause of something, but it's the vehicle for change. That's basically what I would say. Oh, I don't know what here. I'm just going to do that. Ooh, yeah. So digital I am. So yeah, I think it's quite a nice quote. It's about recognizing that you can't necessarily compete with them, but they're also not meant to be. It's a unique area, it's unique products, and etc. And then the cross-border part of it, which I think is also relevant here in Iceland, is the collaborative aspect. Because if this is an area that is not really recognized by the national levels in the two countries, then collaborating and showing how great this mega region actually is and how much it means for national revenue as well, the voice is much stronger if it comes together and is an actual concerted industry. And I mean, digitalization doesn't necessarily play a part in that, but the communication of it, like the communication between people, is aided that way. As for the other aspects, it's about the platforms and networks that you can create. Like, if you have a platform that can actually bring people, will allow this one person to find and connect up with people that could help you to digitalize your business in one way or another, then that's kind of the role that the cross-border committees and the regional authorities can actually play. Again, it's a raising, like they can also help the regional authorities in this area, could also help raising awareness of the composition of the market. Who are the other actors? Who can you collaborate with? Because sometimes it's just about the knowledge, about who else is there, and not just be so inwardly that you think about only your own sector. And finally, it's a vehicle to reach a new goal, and it's about a new vision, and it's about creating that common vision in this area. And I think that goes for everywhere where the industries are small and it seems very far away from the actual power centers. And that's how you create a much stronger voice together. So that's not what I was going to say next, but that's what Lina is going to say. And I hope that was not too much about the cross-border aspect and a bit more about the digitalization and the growth. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, thank you.
And I guess the only other thing I want to say is thank you for your time and coming and listening to us, and also to invite you, if you have the time and the interest, and we would love to have you join us downstairs for some lunch. And you've heard a lot from us. I apologize for that if it's a lot of talking, but actually we want to hear from you this afternoon about for this new project that we embark on now, which is about identifying the challenges and opportunities for rural businesses, small businesses in rural areas in the context of digitalization. And I really hope that you'll be able to join us and we can have a really nice chat down there. Thanks very much, everyone.
Well, thank you for your inspiring and interesting presentation. Not all of us will be able to join downstairs. Are you moving on straight ahead for lunch and workshop, or will there be time if there are some questions?
Yeah, if people have time, we
Okay. Anyone?
or even just comments is also welcome.
Yeah.
Well, if not, then I just would like to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Ja.